Okay, we're going to get started as people still sign in. It's good to see you all. Welcome. I am your host for today's call. Today's emergency policy and practice discussion call. I'm June Tales, disability policy consultant and contractor with CFILC's Disaster Coalition. So first, we'll get started with Carla from CFILC giving us the accessibility briefing. Over to you, Carla.
Hello, thank you for everyone for joining us today. First off, I'd like to, if you'd like to access captions, you can go to the meeting controls on the bottom of your screen and select the CC icon titled Live Transcript. And you can click the option Show Subtitle to gain access to captioning. You can also use the stream text link that I will drop in the text of the chat shortly, and this will be a great option for you because you can change the font size, font color, or make the captioning full screen. We'll be answering questions throughout the presentation, and we'll try our very best to address everyone's questions with the time that we have. Thank you for sitting through my bit of housekeeping, and I will now hand it off today to June.
Thank you. So again, welcome. And as people are still dropping into the call, let me just review for you what we have planned for future calls. In September and October, we have another hot topic on emergency registries, and we're calling this misleading, harmful, and non-inclusive fix. So this has been a topic that has continued to be controversial and not well understood. So we have a panel consisting of myself, Marcy Roth, and Alexandra Enders, and the panel will be moderated by Shaylin Suzales, co-executive director of the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. So that will be for September and October. In November, we have our second annual Gadgets and Gifts, kind of a group share of your favorite emergency gadgets, tools, books, etc. It's kind of a way to think about the season, and for some people, it's a way to think about what they might need that they don't have, or what emergency gift they might want to give, or what emergency related gift they might want to ask for. So it's always a fun sharing time. In December, we're planning a special treat, which is a viewing of a very important video called Cooked: Survival by Zip Code. And the focus there will be on heat waves, with a group viewing either ahead of time or during the call of the heat wave that occurred in the summer of 1995 in Chicago. And there's lots to discuss in this video regarding future planning, regarding what is preparedness, regarding equity issues. So it's a really important video to watch, and a real treat to be able to discuss it as a group. In January and February, we're going to visit recovery issues, not well understood by most people, but extremely important, as it is the longest disaster phase that gets the least amount of attention. It's very complex and lengthy, and we'll explore what are our roles working with people we support in the recovery phase. So heads up for today, we will ask for your feedback, a short poll at the end, and also in chat, we'll post some feedback questions as well that we'd like to hear from you. So you can, at any time, if you're able, think about 1 or 2 lessons that you can apply from today, either do's or don'ts, any aha insights that maybe sparked a jump start for you or a new idea or practice, as well as what additional information would you like to hear about on this topic or future emergency policy and practice topics. So if you can, please introduce yourself in chat, your name, your title, what organization you're with, where it's located, and if you want, your email. So reminder today, mute your mic until you're ready to ask that question, and then please identify yourself each time you speak. And also you're free to post questions in chat throughout the discussion. So today, I guess my magical thinking was that this topic today would maybe be more behind us than it actually is. But the reality is we seem to be living in times of escalating infectious diseases. So today, unlike what I thought, remains a very hot topic. Looking at the Presidential COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force, which met last year from February until October, and Andy Imparato, our speaker, was one of 12 appointees by President Biden, one of 12 members of this group. Its recommendations and implementation plan were delivered to the White House and published back in November. And we will post those links as well in chat. So care to share really more about the details of this task force, the processes, the members, how members were selected, progress, next steps, specific advocacy directions we may want to consider, is Andy Imparato. And Andy is the Executive Director of Disability Rights California. That's our P&A, or Protection and Advocacy Agency in California. And we will post his full bio in chat with the link. For those of you who don't know, DRC, Disability Rights California, is a $41 million legal services agency with a robust staff of 330 people and 26 offices in California, serving Californians with all types of disabilities. So I've known Andy for decades and long time. So prior to coming back to California, Andy was the Disability Policy Director for Tom Harkett on the U.S. Senate Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions Committee way back when. And he was also the president and CEO of AUCD, the American Association of People with Disabilities. And he was also the worked for a while for National Council on Disability, I believe, as General Counsel. So Andy, over to you. Take it away.
Well, thank you, June. It's great to be here. Am I coming through okay? Can you hear me okay?
Fine.
Great. Well, so I'm hoping this could be kind of an informal discussion. There's a lot of people on the call who I recognize and I've known for years, in addition to you, June, and I welcome, as questions come up, everybody to chime in if people have ideas or other perspectives that they want to share. So June sent me a list of questions. So I'm going to just kind of use her questions as a jumping off point, but if people post things in the chat or raise your hand and want to ask follow-up questions, feel free to do that as I'm speaking, and I'm happy to pause and try to answer questions as I go. Just fill in a little bit more about my background. I grew up in Southern California, which is why June talked about me coming back to California. I went to law school in Northern California, started my career in Boston, worked for the Protection and Advocacy Agency in Massachusetts called the Disability Law Center, and then came to Washington in '93 to work for Senator Harkin when he was the chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy, which had done the leadership work on the Americans with Disabilities Act and a lot of other laws that were focused on improving rights and opportunities for people with disabilities. And then I kind of bounced around in government and outside government, worked for Paul Miller, another person with California ties at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, National Council on Disability when Marka Bristow from Chicago was the chair, and then went to AAPD for 11 years. I was their first kind of full-time president and CEO, went back to work for Harkin, and then I was at the Association of University Centers on Disabilities for 6 years before taking the job at Disability Rights California. And I started a month before the pandemic started, so it was an interesting time to start a new job. DRC is by far the biggest thing that I've ever run, so it's a lot. There's a lot happening. It's exciting to continue to think about how best to leverage all the capacity that we have. But I think one of the things that we, have really tried to prioritize, especially in the last 2.5 years, is equity and really thinking about our mission and how to lift up populations in California that have been on the margins of society and on the margins of the services and supports that our state administers. So, the first question that June asked me is, can you talk about member selection for the Biden-Harris COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force, subject matter expert selection, and the process to get to the report and the recommendations? So, one of the first things that President Biden did when he took office on his first day was he signed an executive order that called for the creation of a health equity task force that really had two marching orders. One was to develop recommendations that could help the administration address equity issues in the ongoing pandemic. And then a second was to develop longer-term recommendations that would help us be better prepared for future pandemics and, have policies and structures in place that would help us avoid some of the equity issues that played out in this pandemic. The person that really drove a lot of this for the White House, both during the campaign and then as the president took office, was a clinician at Yale named Marcella Nunez-Smith. She had worked with Biden as a candidate and, was involved in a lot of Biden's policy development during the campaign. I have the sense that she was very involved in drafting the executive order that he signed. And one of the things that I appreciated about the executive order is there was a very clear shout out to people with disabilities as a marginalized population that needed to be addressed as part of the work of the Health Equity Task Force. And as I'm sure a lot of folks on this call know, when we have conversations about equity or diversity, equity, and inclusion, or health disparities, disability is not always explicitly included in the conversation. And the chair of the task force, Marcella Nunez-Smith, I think was predisposed to include disability in part because she grew up in the Virgin Islands with a father who had a disability. she has children with disabilities, and she has her own lived experience with disabilities and chronic health conditions. So I feel, I feel lucky that the person that ended up being the point person for the president on these issues did not have to be kind of educated or reminded about the importance of disability as a health equity issue. The way that I kind of found out about this possibility is I got an email from her, and she asked to talk to me. And I knew that she was part of the White House COVID response team, which was one of her jobs. She had lots of hats while we were doing this work. So I talked to her the next day, and she said, "Are you okay with me putting your name forward to be a public member of this task force?" And at that point, they thought there would be 12 public members. I told her I thought there were other people in the disability world that had kind of a stronger background in health policy, but if she wants to put my name forward, I'm open to it. And she said that I had been recommended by a bunch of people. I still don't know who recommended me to her. I'm guessing one of the people was Catherine Lehman, who had an equity job in the Domestic Policy Council at the White House, and who had worked for Governor Newsom, and before that was the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, which is where I got to know her. She's another person that has always done a great job of integrating disability into her approach to civil rights enforcement and equity, and I'm just a big fan of hers. So I'm guessing she may have mentioned me to Marcella, but at any rate, these things, often happen out of the blue, and you're not always sure why. And I think for me, I have lived experience with bipolar disorder, and I thought that having kind of somebody that was out and open with a mental health disability as part of this equity task force could be a positive thing. So at any rate, they ended up putting my name forward and appointing me. And, I had very little advance warning that the appointment was going to be announced. And then we just entered into what our chair called a monthly sprint, where we were basically trying to come up with recommendations as quickly as we could on different topics. So the first month we were focused on data. Second month we were focused on mental health. We just kind of, the chair kind of broke up a bunch of different topics that were relevant both in the ongoing pandemic and in preparing for future pandemics. And we had a monthly meeting where we had a discussion and tried to arrive at consensus on things that we thought were worth putting forward as interim recommendations. And the concept was we didn't want to wait until a final report to get good ideas out there that could be implemented and could save lives during the pandemic. So we ended up generating between February and October of last year over 300 recommendations. And many of them were implemented by the time we issued our final report. I think one of the statistics I saw was over half of our recommendations had been implemented, or at least partially implemented, by the time we issued our final report. So I think the sprint concept and the idea of getting ideas out there quickly ended up paying off and ended up being a positive strategy. So in addition to the 12 public members of the task force, we also had federal agencies represented on the task force. So we had probably 15 people on the task force that were full-time federal employees that were kind of representing the perspective of the Justice Department or Housing and Urban Development or the Department of Labor or different parts of the Department of Health and Human Services. The part of HHS that kind of owned the task force is called the Office of Minority Health, which was the part of HHS that had kind of played a leadership role on health disparities generally. So, I think the goal of the White House and the chair of the task force, Marcella Nunez-Smith, in selecting the 12 members is she was looking for people that had direct connections to different marginalized populations and could lift up those issues and help the task force engage with subject matter experts that could help us develop recommendations around those issues. So one of the task force members was a member of an Alaskan tribe and had strong national connections to indigenous communities across the United States. One of the task force members was a Latinx woman who'd been involved with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, was a former Obama appointee. Her name is Myra Alvarez, and she runs a nonprofit in Southern California. So Myra and I, her nonprofit is focused on children's health issues and a lot of focus on equity within that. So Myra and I were the two task force members from California. One of the members was a nurse from Minnesota who kind of had a real on the ground perspective and was connected to labor organizations that represented nurses. One of the task force members was the CEO of a rural hospital in Indiana. One was the dean of a medical school that educates a lot of African-American physicians. So it was really an interesting mix of folks. One of the task force members was a high school student when he was appointed to the task force from Florida. Incredibly impressive young man who was kind of bringing a youth perspective to our work. So, we kind of quickly, all of our work was done virtually. I think when they created the task force, they thought we might come together in person. We never came together in person. Everybody was doing it as a volunteer. They created 4 committees, and the 2 committees that I served on included the one that was focused on data, which was chaired by Janae Caldoun, who was the head of the Department of Public Health for the state of Michigan, and now has a health equity job at CVS Health. And then I was also on the Communications and Collaboration Task Force, which was chaired by Myra Alvarez, the other task force member from California. And that committee, Communication and Collaboration, ended up having a pretty broad swath of things that we talked about. A lot of it was about interagency collaboration to address issues that were bigger than what any one agency might be able to handle. Data is a good example of that, but there were lots of issues that we worked on that really required good interagency collaboration. On the communications side, I think one of the really interesting things that we struggled with as a task force was how to deal with the politicization of scientific information that we all witnessed, and we're still witnessing in the context of the pandemic. And is there a way to kind of create a place where people can get good information and not have it get spun in a political way? And one of the task force members, who was the guy who ran the hospital in Indiana, he came up with the idea that we needed something for public health that would be similar to the National Weather Service. The way the National Weather Service works is you have kind of people in Washington, D.C. that are trying to monitor the weather and deliver real-time information about the weather. And they're relying heavily on people on the ground all over the country who are reporting data to them that can help them, reflect what's happening around the country. And those folks on the ground are not federal employees. So it's an integrated network where there's been a lot of trust built up over time that helps us keep track of the weather. And he felt like we needed something like that for public health, especially, in a pandemic where, there's a partnership between people in Washington, D.C., people in Atlanta, people on the ground across the country, and everybody's sharing data and then using the data to try to make good decisions. So we did these monthly sprints, and then we took a pause in the summer to work on our final report. I ended up chairing the group that was tasked with thinking about implementation. So alongside of our final report, we ended up issuing an implementation report. And let me just pause for a second. I see June has a question. Can we talk about the process of getting some of the recommendations out quickly prior to the full written report? So June, yeah, thanks for asking that question. So we developed those recommendations in our committees. So we had 4 committees, the 2 that I was on, and there was one that was focused on access to healthcare, and there was one that was focused on xenophobia and structural barriers to equity. So each of these committees met every month and tried to drill down on whatever the topic of the month was. We came up with recommendations that related to our area. So the data committee came up with data recommendations. The communication and collaboration committee came up with recommendations related to those topics. And then we fed those recommendations into the full task force, and we had a monthly meeting at the end of the month where we actually voted on the recommendations. So it was all very fast. That's why they call them sprints. The good news was, because we were an independent task force, we didn't have to run our recommendations by the Office of Management and Budget. So it would have been very hard for us to do everything we did as quickly as we did if we had to get the kind of clearance that is required when it's a federal agency doing something officially. So to me, that's one of the benefits of these independent bodies. The National Council on Disability has a similar opportunity to make recommendations without running things through OMB. And I just think you can move a lot more quickly when you have that opportunity. And sometimes you can lift up ideas that would not see the light of day if they had to go through an OMB clearance process, but that doesn't mean they're not good ideas. So June, does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, Andy, but how did it work? In other words, so these got underlined very quickly in your communities, and then so once you wanted to promote them more quickly, what was the process? What happened? How did that work? Where did they go? Who saw them?
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty kind of controlled process. Each committee had staff from the Office of Minority Health, and then there were interns, and there were people who were detailed to the Office of Minority Health to help with the task force. As we got later in the process, they hired Deloitte, and there were kind of health policy experts who worked for Deloitte that were contracted to support us. But you know, it all happened within that group. So we would generate an idea, we would kick it around, it would get shaped as an actual recommendation, and we would have, you know, a few opportunities to look at it, fine tune it, and then it would get surfaced with the rest of the task force. It was pretty fast, and you know, the tasks of the staff who tried to staff us was not easy, because you know, they were trying to pull information wherever they could find it. They were trying to make sure, you know, the stuff that we were recommending was implementable, was actionable, but it all happened very quickly without the usual, you know, layers that happen in federal policymaking. Is it okay if I look at Marcy's question, June?
Please do.
Yeah, so Marcy, feel free to, I don't know if you have to jump off, but feel free to vocalize it too. But you're asking if I could talk about why there was so little focus on preventing institutionalization and protecting people who are being exposed when others are moved from hospital beds. By the way, we're worried about the illegal use of these waivers and monkeypox too. So it's interesting. There is a specific recommendation on that, Marcy, and it is something that we lifted up in different ways during our monthly sprints. We didn't have a monthly sprint where we were clearly focused on what was happening in congregate settings. And I had no input on what the topics were of our monthly sprints. That was stuff that the chair of the task force figured out. I think she may have talked with the chair of the 4 subcommittees about it. But where I saw opportunities to lift that up, I did. There are recommendations in our final report that speak to that. There's one recommendation that specifically speaks to Olmstead and ADA and doing that kind of an analysis and making sure that we're avoiding unnecessary institutionalization. So, you know, people can debate whether we should have had more focus on that, given how many people died in institutional settings and how dangerous they are during a pandemic, on top of the civil rights concerns with institutional settings. But I don't think you can read our recommendations and not see that we have a clear perspective on that as a task force. And, one of the subject matter experts who spoke at one of our meetings was Jennifer Mathis from the Bazelon Center. She's now a Biden appointee at the Justice Department, and in a good position to play a leadership role around Olmstead enforcement. And Disability Rights California has a big Olmstead case going on in Alameda County right now, which the Department of Justice is involved in. So, I mean, it's the work on that and so many other issues continues. But yeah, we could have had more recommendations on that. We could have had more focus on that. But I do think we spoke to it. And one thing that I want to be clear, Marcy, is when I would bring up issues like that, I never got pushback from other task force members. I was kind of blown away at how much support there was on the task force for making sure we were addressing disability issues. So that was good to see. To the extent that there were multiple constituencies represented on the task force, for the most part, there was good solidarity across the different constituencies. And when we made recommendations, for the most part, we made them unanimously. Sometimes during those monthly sprints, somebody would abstain from a particular recommendation if they weren't ready to support it. But our final report, it was a unanimous vote. Everybody on the task force supported all the recommendations. So, Marcia, if you're still there, I don't know if you have a follow-up question or you want to give a different perspective. I can't tell.
I think she had the drop, Andy, but
Okay, yeah.
she'll be listening to this right afterwards, so she can get back on. So thanks.
Yeah. So the recommendations you asked kind of about our process, June, but the actual kind of overarching recommendations in our final report, that I know you have a link to the whole thing, but I just want to lift up kind of the big 5 recommendations. And when I'm involved in things like this, I try to have something big that you can hold in your head when you see a report with 55 recommendations or the 300 interim recommendations. Sometimes it's hard to hold all of that in your head. So the big 5 things that we ended up coalescing around were, and these are in an order that I think reflects priority to some degree. The first recommendation was invest in community-led solutions to address health equity. And that really is about recognizing that the government at every level of government is not going to be as good at figuring out how to address equity issues for marginalized populations as community-based organizations that are directly connected to those populations. So it's really about getting money out to organizations that have the strongest connections to the communities that are most impacted in a pandemic. And one way to think about the mission of the task force, our chair, Marcela Nunez-Smith, said this in one of our meetings, and I really liked the framing. She said, our mission as a task force is to disrupt the predictable patterns of who will be harmed first and who will be harmed worst during a pandemic. So I think the idea of getting money out to community-based organizations reflects the thinking that community-based organizations are in the best position to do that disruption because they have the strongest ties to community, and there's lots of examples of very creative ways that community-based organizations were able to deploy vaccines to populations that were most at risk, where departments of public health often didn't have the relationships, didn't have the knowledge to get to high-risk populations as quickly or creatively as community-based organizations were able to do. So community-led solutions was our #1 recommendation. And obviously there are lots of implications of that for independent living centers and other disability-led organizations and community-based organizations in the disability community. The second recommendation was to enforce a data ecosystem that promotes equity-driven decision-making. And, this one is one that I know the disability community has put a lot of time and attention into. I saw that the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research is working on a long-range plan. I'm hoping improving access to data and disseminating data to help with real-time decision-making during a pandemic is a big priority for NIDLR moving forward. we had Andrew Houghtonville, who runs a federally funded research and training center on disability statistics, come and speak to the task force. I know Tom Olin and other folks engaged with the task force in different ways on this issue of data. But that was our second recommendation, because if you don't have good data, it's very hard to make decisions that support equity. And one of the things that we experienced in California and across the country when we were trying to make decisions about vaccine prioritization was decision makers were using the lack of disability data to not prioritize people with disabilities for vaccines. So we saw that as kind of doubling down on an equity issue. It's not our fault that we don't have good disability data, and then that was getting used against us on whether people with disabilities should be prioritized for vaccines. We had a big fight in California to try to get people under 65 who are at high risk of COVID to be a prioritized group for vaccines. We ended up winning that fight, but the fact that we had to fight so hard for it, to me, was a reflection that public health wanted everything to be data driven, but they weren't really owning the fact that we didn't have enough data to support equitable decision making around vaccines purely through the data that we had. I don't know if you all remember, but the CDC was keeping a list of groups that they knew were disproportionately at risk from COVID, and people with Down syndrome were on that list, but nobody else with an intellectual or developmental disability was on the list. And it just made no sense, but that was based on that they had a study related to Down syndrome. I think it was from the UK, but they didn't have studies related to other intellectual and developmental disabilities. The third kind of our big 5 recommendations was to increase accountability for health equity outcomes. And June and I both serve on a disability advisory council for Centene, which is a big Medicaid managed care company. In my mind, a big part of this recommendation is having state governments and the federal government hold managed care companies and others accountable for getting outcomes related to equity, and forcing conversations with those folks about how they're going to measure that and how they're going to have improvement on that over time. The fourth recommendation was to invest in a representative healthcare workforce and increase equitable access to quality healthcare for all. And if you look at the weeds of those recommendations, it specifically calls out long-term services and supports as part of quality healthcare for all. And then the fifth recommendation was to lead and coordinate implementation of all these recommendations from a permanent White House equity infrastructure. And that was an interesting debate within the task force in terms of who should own these recommendations moving forward. I think there were some folks that thought it made sense for the Department of Health and Human Services to play a leadership role on it. But a lot of folks, including our chair, felt that this was created by the White House. It was something that was inherently an interagency opportunity. The challenges that we were dealing with were not limited to the purview of Health and Human Services. So we ended up landing on saying that this should be coordinated and led from the White House moving forward. So after we issued our report, the chair of the task force, Marcela Nunez-Smith, ended up taking a leave of absence. So she resigned from the White House COVID response team. She was replaced by a physician named Cameron Webb, who's still there. And Cameron Webb is one of the people who's now kind of monitoring equity issues in the context of the White House COVID response team. And then Susan Rice at the Domestic Policy Council has multiple people working for her who are focused on equity. So I would say the leadership on these recommendations moving forward is coming from the Health Equity Task Force, the White House, and the chair of the task force has also shifted. It was Jeff Zients when we were created. They have a new chair now of the COVID response team at the White House. But I think it's really the COVID response team working with the Domestic Policy Council on implementation. And what we don't have, and if you look at our implementation plan, we asked for kind of a 6-month progress report, and we asked for agencies to look at our recommendations and report to the White House. To the extent that that's happening, we don't as task force members, we're not getting regular updates. So what I do get is a ton of emails from the Office of Public Engagement at the White House on all of the stuff that they're doing to promote equity. So I see that there's a lot happening in this space, but I have not seen anybody try to like look at what we recommended and then tell us what progress has happened since our recommendations and kind of what's teed up to come next. So I would say, I don't know if there's a lesson there in terms of maybe we spent too much time trying to write an implementation plan, and we should have spent more time just trying to convince the people whose job it was to implement these recommendations that they were good recommendations. But I'm hoping that when we hit our 1-year anniversary of the recommendations, which will be this November, that the White House will give the public an update on the progress that's been made in the last year, and obviously the ongoing equity issues that are still playing out in this pandemic. So June, I see you have a question in the chat regarding disability data gaps. Any suggestions regarding what we as advocates do while these data gaps are slowly filled? I feel like, as I said before, the part of the federal government that is in the best position to help us think through and kind of develop and implement a strategy around filling disability data gaps is NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, which is led by Anjali Forber-Pratt, who's a academic with a disability. She's also a woman of color. So I feel like even though NIDLR is not, an 800-pound gorilla when it comes to data, certainly compared to CDC or NIH or the Bureau of Labor Statistics or other folks that collect data, they have the deepest knowledge of the disability community and the deepest tentacles into our community. So I feel like NIDLR, and Kate Seelman did some of this when she was the head of NIDLR, but I'm hoping that Anjali can use NIDLR as a convener for all these other folks that lead data efforts for the federal government and really make sure that there is a disability data strategy that is well understood. One of the things that I brought up at multiple task force meetings is during the Clinton administration, we had a national health interview survey disability supplement, which gave us much better granular information about people with disabilities than we had. They did that in 1993 and 1994, and it hasn't been done again since. So part of it is recognizing that we have to spend money to really get this data, and we can't do these things as a one-off. We have to have a regular way of tracking this data and monitoring it if we really want to get at the equity issues. And whatever disability data we have, it has to be intersectional so we can look at what the outcomes are, what the access issues are within the disability community, and where the equity and disparity issues are in our community. So, I think what came out of the task force was clarity that we have huge data gaps and that we shouldn't use the data gaps to limit people's access to vaccines and other things during a pandemic, and that we need to plug those data gaps. And for me, NIDLR will always be in the best position to lead that effort when you compare them to other, data leads within the federal government. So June, I don't know if you have specific thoughts or ideas on that, but I welcome your perspective.
I would just add, Andy, I think, NIDLR is definitely a resource, but what resonates for me is your earlier comment about interim recommendations that you were able to escalate more quickly. When something goes to NIDLR to work on, it's typically a 3 to 5 year process.
Yeah.
So maybe we need to integrate into more of our task forces, advisory councils, and NIDLR grants, interim recommendations that can be escalated more quickly, because 5 years feels like a lifetime.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think there are opportunities to do things more quickly at the state level and at the local level. California has our own version of a health interview survey that is administered by UCLA, and the California Department of Aging has been working with the folks at UCLA to kind of get some more granular questions that can help lift up equity issues within the field of aging. Because of the master plan on aging, which has disability components to it, we've been able to be part of those conversations and think about improving disability data alongside the aging data. But it's a good point, June. And the other thing that I think one of the agencies that was represented on the task force was FEMA. And I think one of the recognitions in California and multiple other states was, and we had recommendations related to this from the task force, was that the California Office of Emergency Services and other emergency response agencies at the state level went into this pandemic with deeper relationships in the disability community and deeper knowledge of the disability community than departments of public health. And you know, if we look at kind of the long term, that kind of gap in relationships needs to be addressed, and specific knowledge of underserved or marginalized populations needs to be addressed if the departments of public health are going to do a good job of leading on equity. So June, you probably remember California Department of Public Health in April, right after the pandemic started, they issued guidelines on crisis standards of care. That there were draft guidelines, but they basically said it's okay to not give somebody a ventilator or other scarce resource during this pandemic if you're in a healthcare rationing situation, if basically they're too disabled or too old to benefit from the resource. And it was basically inviting hospitals and other decision makers to discriminate on the basis of disability and age, which was illegal. So, you know, we pushed back on that. And the California Department of Public Health issued follow-up guidelines in June that were much better. But again, the fact that we had to have a fight in a progressive state with a progressive Department of Public Health not to violate federal civil rights laws in a healthcare rationing situation, and that the Trump Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Health and Human Services, started out in a better position on this issue than the state of California's Department of Public Health. Like, that's embarrassing, but I think it reflects the fact that there were very few people at the California Department of Public Health who had any knowledge at all of disability rights or the disability community. So again, I'm hopeful that one of the structural things that can happen coming out of this pandemic is to get a much stronger beachhead within departments of public health at every level, the state level, the local level, at the CDC level, so that these relationships exist year round. And, you know, and I do think emergency services departments have done a better job. Certainly there's room for improvement on the emergency services side as well. But the concept that people with access and functional needs are an important population for you to actually know something about and have a relationship with when you're responding to a disaster, that concept didn't seem to break through with departments of public health. June, I don't know if you want to comment on that or have any observations on that.
Yeah, Andy, I think those are excellent points about, you know, where does the expertise lie? And the fact that you all had seats on the right committees in California at the time helped with the pushback and helped with to, you know, hold the line about, you know, federal law and what's not legal. I'm still thinking about your disability data gaps, and what resonated for me was first of all, I am not a data person. I know very little except what I hear you all talk about, but the fact that you mentioned the National Health Interview Survey and some of those other American Community Surveys, and the other one, the Burfus and whatever else you all use. To me, that might be an interim way to get the data on a diverse disability community. not just seniors. So I don't know where to go with that, Andy. You know more than I do, but what do we as kind of data lay people, or some of us don't go very deep in data, what do we do with that? You know, I hear questions about, well, to get the right questions in the surveys, you have to pay for it. Somebody has to sponsor it. I mean, there's all of these deep roots of how this works. So, can you comment more on that to help us understand that better?
Yeah, and I see Meg Tracy from the University of Montana has a question in the chat, and Meg is obviously an expert on disability data. So Meg, I welcome your thoughts on June's question as well. The specific question Meg had in the chat is whether there's a policy being proposed to assure the inclusion of HHS minimum disability data set. This, I think when you say ACS 6, you're talking about the 6 questions on the American Community Survey. I'm not sure, but I think that's.
Yep.
And partners in statewide needs assessments funded by ACL and other state and local assessment monitoring work funded by federal agencies. So everything that you're recommending there, Meg, is very consistent with what we recommended as a task force. We didn't get that granular in our report. I think the leadership at ACL, not just at Neidler, but at ACL as a whole under Allison Barkoff, who's the acting assistant secretary, I think would be very supportive of that. So it's really a question of, okay, how do we make this happen budget-wise? How do we get OMB excited about it, Office of Management and Budget at the White House? And one of the questions I would also be asking is, how do we get some of this in statute? So if we get a new administration, we don't lose the commitment because there's new priorities in a new administration. But Meg, I know you've thought a lot about this, and you've got your data coalition that you work with. But anything you want to share on this?
Well, first of all, Andy, thanks for your leadership throughout the pandemic. This is Meg. And I hope to represent, you know, there are wonderful disability data folks in California, and you know them. I'm nowhere near in terms of their expertise, but I work very hard to follow their work. And this data group is, you know, we're trying as well. So I will say everything you said about, you know, in the middle of a pandemic, it's very hard to do anything but keep people alive. And so it was hard to, you know, put forward even how to strengthen what is expected in the ACA, which is all national public health surveys include the ACS 6 as the minimum data set. You know, that didn't happen. In the pandemic, we'd find out later that the National Immunization Survey was going out with one question, which was not going to give the data to really provide the rationale for some of the policy that FEMA and other partners were trying to put out about inclusive and accessible vaccination. So we do need that granular data. We do need standard data. We have the national policy. We need people to follow it. We don't need to be fighting about landscape on questionnaires during the pandemic. And then similarly, I think, you know, we end up having to monitor all the local needs assessments, you know, like a statewide needs assessments on the needs of older adults, and there's no ACS 6 in it. And they're like, what are you talking about? We've never heard of it. Well, you're funded by NCOA. What do you mean you've never heard of it? And so I do think that it is very hard to create, again, like you said, policy and in the middle of the pandemic, but there are certainly opportunities where we need to work towards having better standard data that and not missing opportunities. And I do think the disability-led perspective is different than the healthy aging perspective. And when healthy aging is driving the decision-making, we end up with questions that are related to functional limitation associated with aging. And that is not the same. And it does not mobilize the same trusted partners of the disability community. So the data look different. They're really designed for people working on healthy aging and understanding the complexities of older adults with complex medical issues and functional limitation. They are not to mobilize, you know, all the partners that you know very well.
Yeah, Meg, I'm wondering if you see an opportunity for Neidler and maybe in partnership with AUCD and other groups that have big national networks to like host a disability data summit where one of the goals coming out of the summit is a cohesive agenda that would respond to the gaps that we've experienced and the kind of missed opportunities that we experienced during the pandemic. What do you think of that?
I love that suggestion. I don't know. I see other advocates on the call, but I think that, yeah, very timely and needed.
Yeah, the reason I guess I have summits in my mind right now is I participated in a 2-day summit this week that SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, just hosted because they have a new Office of Recovery, so that they had about 150 people from the kind of mental health world and the substance use world talking together about priorities for a recovery agenda and a new national recovery office. But I think something like that around disability data, that would probably end up being a hybrid where some people are in person and some are remote, which is the way the SAMHSA event was, could be a good opportunity. I'm happy to float that with Anjali and with John Cheetah at AUCD just to see if there's interest, but it feels like it could be a good opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I don't know what others think.
Feel free to raise your hand or post your question in chat. Jude here.
Yeah, while we're waiting, I'll just mention, this is Meg, that, some of the data that gets lost too are our data from group quarters and congregate settings. And there have been some efforts to try and get better monitoring, at least in the CMS certified nursing homes. But there's so much more work to do there. So we try really hard locally, and there's a couple, Georgetown really organized some things in the DC area. I think Wisconsin did some exemplary things in terms of really saying, these are targeted populations with whom we have regular interactions, and we can be monitoring and helping to do just-in-time mitigation of COVID. And we need to elevate those too.
Yeah, well put, Megan. When we think about congregate settings in the California context and nationally, we also need to think about our state hospitals, our prisons and jails, and we don't have great data in terms of what happened with those populations during the pandemic either. And I don't know, one of our task force members, Homer Venters, was at Rikers. He was the in-house physician at Rikers, and now he consults to try to improve access to healthcare in prisons and jails across the country. But he just published an op-ed in the Hill talking about monkeypox and the kind of the dangers connected with monkeypox in prisons and jails. And it looks like we're just going to have a repeat of what we saw during COVID. And again, we're not seeing the kind of leadership we need. And June, you may have seen in the LA Times, there was also an op-ed talking about the disproportionate impact of monkeypox on the Latinx community in California, and that we're not seeing the leadership that we need from the state government to try to address that and prioritize the most vulnerable populations for the kind of scarce treatments that are available for it right now. So it's an ongoing issue.
Andy, June, you mentioned before that you've been monitoring, that you kind of have an onslaught of email and articles that address potentially some of the ways the recommendations of your task force have been used, but none of it's been, well digested to say, well, look at these areas of improvement, or, moving forward a step or two, moving the needle regarding some of your recommendations. So I think for us, learning from you, there might be a kernel of something we should take away from what you're saying about, as we participate ongoing in some of these other task forces, how should we better strengthen that monitoring piece?
Well, it's interesting, June, and I'm not 100% sure what the best lesson to take away from our experience. We actually spent a lot of time thinking about implementation, and we did a completely separate report on implementation, but we weren't the ones that were going to be doing the implementation, and we have very little power to make sure that the implementation happens. So again, I don't know if the lesson from that is don't spend so much time, writing a detailed report that you haven't been tasked with implementing. Spend more time trying to get public commitments from people who are in a position to implement on what they're going to do. It's one thing to recommend that something happen in 55 days or 6 months or a year or 2 years. It's another thing to get something from the White House or, whatever the relevant authority is, that they are committing to do that. So I just, in hindsight is 2020, but I think our time might have been better spent trying to get some public commitments from the White House. When we issued our final report, the White House made a bunch of announcements the day that we delivered our report, including, funding to ACL grantees to do vaccine deployment within the disability community. So it wasn't like there weren't conversations going back and forth, but I think the White House was looking for quick things that they could do immediately, and they weren't looking to kind of commit to a long-term agenda beyond, what the president had done in his executive order. So I don't know, but I feel like maybe we spent too much time writing a plan that we weren't ever going to implement, and we didn't spend enough time trying to talk to the people who were in a position to make those commitments.
Thanks, Andy. That is really helpful for me. And I think that really resonates, as well as your point early on. Some of us serve, for example, on the National Advisory Council on Individuals with Disabilities and Disasters. And it strikes some of us that it's all siloed as one agency's responsibility in terms of instead of an interagency collaboration and cooperation. And that to me feeds into your point about spend more time on getting a commitment for that versus writing a report that people will refer to. In fairness, it does have a life of its own, but not at the same accelerated energy as what you just mentioned in terms of public commitment and interagency commitment.
The other thing that we had as a recommendation that I think is just an interesting thing for us to think about in this ongoing pandemic, we recommended some kind of an after action report where an independent entity could look at everything that happened during the pandemic and, be above partisan politics and really pinpoint kind of decisions that were made that could have had a significant impact on the trajectory of the pandemic for marginalized populations and the lessons learned from it. And we thought of it as kind of like a 9/11 commission. But the difference is 9/11 it had a beginning and an end. And at this point, it's just not clear that this pandemic is going to have an end. So I don't know when is the right time to do an after action report, but maybe that's not the right frame. Maybe we need to do a report at the, March of 2023 as the three-year mark. We call it a 3-year report where we just look at, okay, what happened the last 3 years? What did we learn? How do we apply that over the next 3 years? I don't know what the right frame is, but I do feel like we need some credible kind of non-political entity to really take a hard look at everything that happened and tell some stories that are going to help us make better decisions moving forward. And I also think our task force really did not engage Congress at all. It really wasn't part of our mission to do that. Interestingly, Vice President Harris, when she was a senator, introduced legislation that called for a federal health equity task force. So there was some history of congressional leadership. But I do think if we're going to have kind of a bipartisan, above politics approach to addressing marginalized populations in a pandemic, we have to find a way to engage Congress in the conversation. It can't all be let out of a White House, process.
Yeah, I like your idea of a report, a 3-year report, just from the emergency management lens. I will just urge us all to be careful about calling it an after action report, because those are significantly politicized and homogenized in what the final report is, whereas you label something different, like a 3-year report or hot wash or something that doesn't carry those connotations, you can often say more and be more effective with less whitewashing.
Yeah, good point. Meg, just back on the data thing for a second, you know a lot more about CDC than I do. I learned some when I was at AUCD, but my sense is that CDC has been funding different ways to collect data, including pulse surveys that rely on kind of informal mechanisms with kind of specific groups of people that have agreed to make themselves available for these kind of things. Do you see an opportunity for us to use that kind of a pulse survey model to try to oversample and find what's happening to different populations within the disability community when we're in a disaster, recognizing that we may not have time to solve the bigger data problems that have been with us for a long time?
That's a great idea. So I just wanted to, I think it's the census who runs the household pulse survey. And of course they interact with CDC and that National Center on Health Statistics. Yeah, I think that's an opportunity. I don't know, I feel like that's a heavy lift, but there may be, in terms of the ability to do callback to people who indicate. And again, there's only 4, and they're Washington group set questions on the household pulse survey. And those were added later in the household pulse survey after a lot of advocacy. So maybe yes. And then the BRFIS has different callback protocols as well. So people who indicate, these are adults, indicate disability, there could be some callback. There's a callback for children with asthma from the BRFIS, and there could be some follow-up there. But yeah, that's a great idea. I was just going to indicate too, there's some information in the chat, and there, other sources of data, right, are administrative data in terms of the housing that FEMA creates, how much of it is accessible. I'm trying to evaluate for that. And just also looking not only at the person side of a disability, but also looking at the resources and trying to evaluate of what we create with emergency response funds, how much is accessible and could serve in a response in a universal design way.
Yeah, another equity issue that we had some recommendations on in our final report was making sure that when we do research on things like vaccine efficacy, that we have people with disabilities and people that from different marginalized populations who are part of the research. And it felt like during the pandemic, a lot of the best data we had related to how COVID was impacting people with disabilities and how the new vaccines might interact with people with disabilities was coming from the UK. And I had the sense that part of that is because the UK has requirements that marginalized populations be included in medical research as they're developing vaccines and developing other treatments and interventions. So I think that's worth looking at. Are there laws in the UK that we could replicate here so that we're not left out of research? Because I know when the vaccines were first getting deployed, it's very hard to get any information about, okay, how's this going to work if I have, you know, a particular disability, because we weren't really part of the testing of the vaccine.
Andy, just a time check. We have about 15 minutes at least left. And I want to make sure you, in looking at your notes, are there any other highlights you want to make sure you get to? Because we keep interrupting you.
No, it's fine. I mean, this is what I wanted. I wanted it to be interactive, and I appreciate it. I mean, for me, it's helpful to hear your ideas and just kick it back and forth. The one question that you asked, June, that's an interesting one is, how do you feel? You're asking me, how do I feel about the experience of serving on this task force? Appreciated, frustrations, disappointments. You know, June, as you said, we've known each other a long time. You and I have both been on a lot of different advisory groups. I feel like the older I get, the more I find the groups that are not focused on disability, but want disability to be part of a bigger conversation, create more opportunities for me to learn and build relationships that are going to help me be more effective as an advocate. So that to me was the greatest value of serving on this task force. You know, I really, really appreciated getting to work closely with, you know, 11 people that were coming from very different perspectives. As you can imagine, lots of them had connections to disability that became more apparent over time. But I think one of the mistakes we sometimes make as disability advocates is when somebody's having a conversation about equity or disparities or civil rights, we start with the question, well, what about people with disabilities? And I guess one of the things that I'm trying to get better at is recognize that any work on marginalized populations is going to benefit disabled people, because we are disproportionately in every marginalized population. And I worry that if we're always asking the question, what about disability, but we don't start with the assumption that we do benefit from any focus on marginalized population or poverty, and then we kind of come into that and help them understand how to find the people with disabilities within that population and make sure that whatever's being done is accessible and will actually reach those people with disabilities. That feels like a more effective strategy to me. And I'm trying to get better about not just saying, what about disability, but assuming that disability is in every conversation and then trying to like help them figure out how to reach the people that we assume they're already trying to reach. They just may not know how. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I just think that framing might get us further. I remember during the Affordable Care Act, and June, you may have been part of some of these conversations. Barbara Kornblau went to every health disparity conversation during the Affordable Care Act discussion saying, what about disability? What about disability? And trying to make sure that disability was part of health disparities. And I don't feel like we got very far with that strategy. And I think maybe a different strategy might have produced better outcomes. I don't know.
I think that's a really good point, Andy. I think that some of us become complacent and comfortable only talking to each other, and that's talking to the choir. So it's not only branching out to we have a better impact, but thinking about the strategy of how to get that impact. And I think that's the art and science of all of this, is what you just said. It's not just asking a broad-based question where people look at you like you're a deer in the headlights, but really cultivating the thinking. I mean, that's an art form.
Yeah.
Andy, this is Meg. I was just going to add, at that time, part of it is too understanding what the agenda is and what the goals are. And, we had really effective advocates who worked, directly with Senator Baucus here in Montana and said the goal of healthcare reform is to lead more independent, longer, healthy, happy lives, which is totally resonating with the values, of the rural West. And they were telling their stories. Here's what we need to be a part of that. And you know, those local conversations matter too, and understanding, you know, that we all have some shared goals.
Yeah, June, if it's okay, I know we're almost out of time, but I would like to ask you a question. My sense is that California, and I remember you were doing earthquake response stuff before a lot of people in the disability community were talking about emergency response, in part because you were in California and you were seeing what was happening with earthquakes. But I just feel like California is ahead of the curve in a lot of ways around disasters, in part because of your leadership, Vance's leadership, the leadership at Cal OES. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about what's the connection between that and this new reality we have about pandemics, and maybe the pandemics are going to be something we're living with for the rest of our lives or the foreseeable future. Like, basically, how do we transfer the knowledge and leadership and capacity that's been built up in emergency services and move it into public health and other places that are tasked with responding to pandemics? Or should we give emergency services a bigger role in responding to pandemics? I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Oh, I could take up another whole call on that. But I think my thinking is that we often make a mistake by looking at only one or two buckets. And to do this well and do this right, we have to be represented in many different departments and agencies. We have this magical thinking that emergency services is going to do it all in this space, or public health is going to do it all. And we forget about all the other players, aging, transportation, the federally qualified health clinics, all of the players. So yeah, I think we've done a lot in some areas, but we also forget to include the entire orchestra instead of just the violinist. So I think it's a difficult lesson to implement, but and I'm never comforted by Andy when we say, well, we've done a lot in California, but we're always looking at what we haven't done.
No.
What we need to do. So we're not complacent. It might look good to others, but it's like, maybe we're just so buried in the weeds that we don't look often enough at the forest. But instead of looking at the, where we've been, where do we want to get to and how do we get there? So for me, some of your takeaways from the task force really resonate for me and what I want to implement in terms of spending more time on getting commitment versus writing documents, spending more time on making sure that these issues aren't siloed in just, the Office of Minority Health or ASPR, which stands for something new now, the administration on, gotta look it up. They've been elevated in their importance, given what's going on with the pandemic. They have a little more responsibility now than they did before, given to them by the administration. But whatever federal or state department it is, we've got to be figure out how to impact, their role in all this and improve their disability lens. So there's a lot to think about in what you put forward. I don't know if that answers your question, Andy.
No, it does. And I agree with your point that we need capacity and knowledge and deep relationships across government, and we can't put all our eggs in one basket, but whether you're talking about state government, federal government, or local government, I agree with that. The other thing that we didn't really do much of as a task force was try to learn from what other countries did during the pandemic. And I feel like there's still a lot to be learned there. I still don't fully understand why the impact of the pandemic was so dramatically different in different countries. But I feel like if we do a 3-year report, I'm hoping part of a 3-year report is looking at what can we learn from New Zealand or wherever, because we clearly made a lot of mistakes, and it's worth looking at what other people did and how it was different.
Excellent point. Gets us out of that tunnel US vision. Anything else, Andy? You still got another 4 whole minutes to make some.
I guess the other thing I'll just say, is when our community is represented on these time-limited task forces, it's worth thinking about how do we support the people that represent our community on these task forces. And I reached out to Andrew Houghtonville when we were working on data, and I reached out to Jennifer Mathis and Claudia Center when we were working on mental health. And I did some quick outreach and was able to plug people in. Kara Ayers came and spoke at one of our meetings. But like I feel like at some point it would be helpful, especially for folks that are funded to do work and have decades of experience, to not wait to be called, but to really try to put some actionable ideas in front of the person who is most motivated to bring these forward, and just have almost like a back office support capacity for whoever's representing our community on these different entities. And I think it worked. I got what I needed when I needed it, but I wasn't hearing from everybody. And sometimes it helps to be hearing from more than one person or somebody that I happen to know. So I just think that's also worth thinking about as we have these opportunities with a friendly administration. How do we equip the people that are representing us so that we're not missing the opportunities?
It's a good takeaway, Andy, and maybe I'm guilty of that too. So what I interpret you're saying is whatever our representative is, either at the local level or the state level or a task force or a White House group, make sure we're holding those people accountable. For example, maybe I should have sent you more points after you were appointed, and maybe you all should be sending us more points, those of us who are on the National Advisory Council on Individuals with Disability and Disasters with the administration, or some advances groups. Send us what you want us to elevate, hold us all accountable. I mean, if we're the so-called disability representative, whatever, make sure that we're hearing from you as well. I mean, that's my takeaway from what you said.
Yeah, it's holding us accountable, but it's also kind of surfacing ideas. I mean, June, there's a moment in a policy development process where people are listening. And it's really about, let's get our best ideas in there in a format where people understand it and can implement it. So we had moments during the work of the task force where people were listening to our ideas on data or mental health or whatever the sprint topic of the day was. And I just think trying to distill what we know and get it to the people that are doing the work. I just want us to get better at that as a movement. And I think the Neidler grantee ecosystem, is trying to get better at distilling what we know from a research standpoint and giving it to policymakers in a format where they know what to do with it. But so this is, to me, just one version of that.
Well, we thank you, Andy, for a very rich and high-level discussion. I think there are a lot of takeaways here, a lot of layers, and I know for one, I have to re-listen to some of this because there's some varied ideas that may have flown by me that I still need to go back and pick up on as somebody who does sit on some of these other groups. lots of good ideas, I think, here. And I appreciate your sharing the value of our time with us today. We're going to put up a poll for those of you who are still listening and can also take the poll. But in the last 2 minutes, anyone else that wants to pipe in with an idea or last minute piece?
Hey, Andy, it's Meg. I'm just, one of the things that happened was that vaccine providers were stood up before like their legal obligations were well understood around the ADA. Any thoughts about that?
Well, again, for me, it's doing an analysis of who made that decision. What did they kind of have access to when they made the decision, and how do we make sure that the people making those decisions are better equipped, so it doesn't happen again. But to me, it's one of many examples where a lot of those decisions were made by departments of public health at the state level or the local level. And in California, it's a lot of local, we have a lot of counties, it's a lot of local decision makers. And many of them were embarrassingly ignorant about accessibility or federal legal requirements. So it's you could say it's a failure on the part of civil rights enforcement. It's a failure on the part of Disability Rights California to educate them. But it's something we definitely need to fix.
Anyone else? Well, thank you all again. Join us again next month for an in-depth discussion on registries, emergency registries for people with disabilities. What's the harm issues? What are the problems? What do we need to recognize? So again, thank you all for joining us, and big thanks to you, Andy. Lots of good food for thought. So thank you all.
Take care.
And we will post this on the CFILC channel for any of you who joined late or want to share this with someone else. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.